Here, a lizard has hunted the same shores for millions of years, venomous enough to kill in hours. 17,000 islands born from fire. Sea nomads who never touch land. A paradise so vast and violent it shouldn't exist. This is Indonesia, and nothing can prepare you for what's hiding inside it. The ring of fire that built a nation. Sitting directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, Indonesia harbors over 130 active volcanoes, more than any other country on Earth. For comparison, Japan has around 110 spread across a much larger landmass, while Indonesia packs its collection into a tropical archipelago where the volcanoes are never far away. If you travel between islands on a clear morning, you'll notice their cones breaking through the cloud line, some quietly smoking, others dormant for decades but never truly asleep. The country sits right on the seam where the Indo-Australian plate grinds beneath the Eurasian plate, and all that pressure has to go somewhere. Some of these volcanoes behave in ways that seem almost otherworldly. Mount Ijen vents electric blue sulfur flames that burn down its slopes at night. If you climb it before dawn, you'll find miners carrying baskets of raw sulfur up from the crater floor, working in gas masks beside flames that appear to leak from the rock itself. The blue fire is not lava but ignited sulfuric gas, reaching temperatures of around 600 degrees Celsius. And it is one of the only places on Earth where you can see this phenomenon. Mount Bromo opens into a vast sand caldera stretching across the horizon. Rather than a single peak, the landscape is a flat sea of volcanic ash ringed by cliffs, with a cluster of cones rising from the floor like islands. Visitors typically cross the caldera by jeep in the pre-dawn dark and wait on a viewpoint to watch the sun illuminate the whole expanse. It feels less like a mountain and more like a planet that hasn't finished forming. And Mount Kelimutu holds 3 crater lakes that shift color unpredictably between turquoise, black, and red. Each lake sits in its own crater, side by side, and scientists attribute the changes to mineral-rich gases rising from the volcanic system below. One morning, a lake might be a bright, almost tropical blue. Weeks later, the same surface could turn dark as ink. Locals have long believed the lakes are resting places for the departed, and the color changes are said to reflect the moods of the spirits who live there. That said, these same active geological forces regularly trigger earthquakes and tsunamis. But that's only half the story. The ash and lava that periodically tear through the landscape also break down into exceptionally rich volcanic soil. Not just farmland, but one of the most productive agricultural foundations in Southeast Asia, feeding a nation of around 270 million people. Interestingly, the destruction and the abundance come from the exact same source. The same forces that built these volcanoes above the sea also carved deep trenches beneath it. And in those waters, life took a very different path. Before we go any further, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country or city in the comments below. I'm curious how many places are exploring Indonesia with me at this exact moment. Islands of isolation, where evolution went rogue. Those deep oceanic trenches acted as natural barriers, cutting each island off from its neighbors and allowing life to evolve in directions found nowhere else on the planet. If you travel to Komodo National Park, a rugged chain of small islands between Sumbawa and Flores, you'll come face to face with the proof. The Komodo dragon, the world's largest venomous lizard, reaches around 3 meters in length and weighs roughly 70 kilograms, and it has walked these shores for millions of years, looking less like a modern reptile than something that simply forgot to go extinct. Not just a large lizard, was a genuine prehistoric relic confined to a handful of islands by the same waters that isolated it. The same pattern of isolation shaped life across the wider archipelago. Sumatra and Borneo shelter critically endangered orangutans and matriarchal Sumatran elephant herds, each species carved into distinct populations by the trenches and forests that kept them apart. If you trek into the ancient rainforests of these islands, you'll notice the differences almost immediately. The orangutans of Sumatra are leaner and longer-haired than their Bornean cousins, shaped by subtle variations in diet and canopy structure that compounded over millennia. Both populations now cling to shrinking ranges, their numbers thinned by deforestation in habitats that once felt impossibly remote. The Sumatran elephant, meanwhile, is smaller than its Asian relatives, and its herds follow forest corridors along river systems that have shaped their migration routes for countless generations, paths that predate any human map. However, the most dramatic frontier was underwater. The Coral Triangle, a vast marine zone encompassing the waters around Raja Ampat and Nusa Penida, is considered by biologists to be the most biodiverse marine environment on Earth. And here's something worth noting. It contains more coral species than the entire Caribbean. If you dive anywhere in this triangle, you'll find a world that defies easy description. Pygmy seahorses no larger than a fingernail cling to sea fans in colors that seem invented. Schools of fish move as single organisms, shifting direction in unison like weather systems. Giant manta rays with wingspans of about 7 meters glide through these currents alongside the mola mola, or ocean sunfish, the heaviest bony fish in the world, which can weigh roughly 1,000 kilograms. You'll find creatures here that look like they were assembled from mismatched parts. Evolution, left alone in warm waters, simply went to work. One thing that stands out is how all of it traces back to the same isolation. Each island its own laboratory. Each stretch of sea its own experiment. But long before anyone arrived to study these creatures, people were already building civilizations on these same volcanic shores, and what they left behind still stands today. What do you think about this? A giant, venomous lizard that survived millions of years just because it got trapped on a few islands. Sounds crazy, right? If you think this is wild, comment the number 4 below. Because next, we're leaving the wildlife behind and stepping into a culture that's even stranger, where an entire civilization was built in the shadow of a volcano. Temples built in the shadow of fire. If you want to understand where Indonesian civilization first took root, Central Java is where you end up. The historic core of ancient Indonesian civilization, where early kingdoms built their most ambitious monuments directly into the shadows of the volcanoes that shaped their world. Near the city of Yogyakarta stands Borobudur, a massive 9th century Buddhist monument that lay buried beneath volcanic ash for centuries before its rediscovery. And here's something worth noting. Borobudur isn't just a temple. It's the largest Buddhist monument anywhere in the world, constructed from around 2 million volcanic stone blocks and arranged in 9 terraced levels that pilgrims would circle slowly upward, spiraling toward a central stupa at the summit. If you walk its galleries today, you'll find over 2,500 relief panels carved into the walls, each one narrating a fragment of Buddhist cosmology in astonishing detail. The whole structure was eventually abandoned, swallowed by jungle and layers of ash, and more or less forgotten for the better part of a millennium. Mount Merapi, which looms over the region, is one of the most active volcanoes in the world. It erupts with a regularity that would terrify most populations into leaving. But the Javanese didn't leave. They built their greatest monuments in its shadow, using the very stone it provided. The volcanic soil was extraordinarily fertile, supporting dense populations and the agricultural surplus that massive construction requires. In a real sense, the same forces that periodically destroyed these kingdoms also made them possible. Not far away lies Prambanan, a soaring 9th century Hindu temple complex dedicated to the Trimurti, the threefold deity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Where Borobudur spreads outward in concentric terraces, Prambanan climbs sharply upward, its central spires reaching around 150 feet into the tropical sky. You'll find it striking that these two monumental complexes, one Buddhist and one Hindu, were built within the same century, only a few miles apart. The proof that early Java held multiple faiths in creative tension long before Islam arrived. These stone monuments showcase the architectural mastery of early Javanese kingdoms, built alongside active volcanoes like Mount Merapi. But the spiritual traditions these kingdoms nurtured didn't simply disappear when the temples fell silent. They traveled east across a narrow stretch of sea to an island that would carry them forward in a form you can still witness today. That island is Bali. If you visit its villages, you'll find Hindu rituals and temple ceremonies alive in daily life, preserved with a devotion that Central Java itself eventually surrendered. The builders of Borobudur and Prambanan would recognize them instantly. The people who never touch land, and the villages of the dead. Home to the world's largest Muslim population, Indonesia operates as a secular state that recognizes 6 official religions under the motto, Unity in Diversity. Over 700 ethno-linguistic groups are unified by Bahasa Indonesia, a single national language that serves as a bridge across an archipelago where, without it, neighbor might not understand neighbor. If you travel to the waters off Sulawesi, you might encounter the Bajau, a nomadic people often called sea gypsies, who have spent centuries living almost entirely on the ocean. Entire families live on houseboats, fishing the same reefs their ancestors fished, with no permanent address on land and, traditionally, little use for national borders. But here's what makes the Bajau genuinely remarkable. They have adapted to life at sea at the genetic level. Studies have shown that the Bajau possess unusually large spleens, roughly 50% larger than those of neighboring land-based populations, which act as biological oxygen reservoirs, allowing them to free dive to depths of around 60 meters on a single breath, remaining underwater for several minutes at a time while hunting fish with handmade spears. It is not training. It is biology. The Minangkabau of West Sumatra, by contrast, operate one of the largest matrilineal societies in the world, where property and family lineage pass through women. And in the highlands of South Sulawesi, the Toraja people practice funeral traditions so elaborate they can stretch across months or even years. For the Toraja, death is not a single event, but a long, staged process. Families save for decades to afford a proper funeral, because in Toraja belief, the soul does not truly depart until the ceremonies are complete. The dead remain in the family home, sometimes in a special room, sometimes in the same living space, treated not as gone, but as simply ill. You'll find that this unsettles outsiders. Among the Toraja, it is ordinary. When the funeral finally arrives, it is a massive communal gathering. Water buffalo are sacrificed, sometimes in great numbers, their count reflecting the family's status and the deceased's passage into the afterlife. The bodies are then placed in tombs carved directly into cliff faces or represented by wooden effigies called tau that stand on balconies overlooking the valley, silent figures watching over the living below. One thing that stands out is how these cliffs become villages of the dead, entire galleries of faces set into the stone, as if the ancestors never truly left. These are not just museum pieces. They are living traditions in a nation that refuses to collapse into a single identity. And if Indonesia's cultures are this varied, its cuisine tells an even older story. The spice that built the modern world. Indonesia's cuisine begins not in kitchens, but on a handful of small, remote islands that once reshaped the entire world. The Maluku Islands, historically known as the Spice Islands, are scattered across the eastern reaches of the archipelago, and for centuries they were the only place on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew naturally. If you had stood on one of these islands in the 16th century, you would have been standing on what was arguably the most valuable real estate on the planet. European powers sailed across uncharted oceans, fought wars, and redrew maps just to control what grew here. Nutmeg was once worth more than gold by weight, and cloves were so prized that Dutch traders reportedly burned entire harvests to keep prices artificially high. The spice trade didn't just flavor Indonesia's cuisine. It launched the age of exploration and connected continents that had never been in contact before. Interestingly, what grew from that history is a national palette of remarkable range. Staples like slow-cooked beef rendang, nasi goreng, satay, and gado-gado appear across the archipelago, each one a descendant of the trade routes that first carried these flavors to Indonesian shores. Rendang, originating from the Minangkabau people of West Sumatra, is beef simmered for hours in coconut milk and a paste of galangal, lemongrass, and turmeric until the liquid evaporates completely, and the meat is coated in a dark, caramelized crust of its own reduced spices. If you've had it prepared properly, you'll find the texture is less like a curry and more like a concentrated spiced jerky. Tender inside, intensely flavored throughout. Nasi goreng, Indonesia's everyday fried rice, relies on kecap manis, a thick, sweet soy sauce that is itself a legacy of Chinese trade influence. Satay varies dramatically by region. Chicken skewers in Jakarta come with a sweet peanut sauce, while in Bali the sauce might incorporate palm sugar and lime in proportions that change the entire character of the dish. Gado-gado, literally mix, is a salad of boiled vegetables, eggs, tofu, and tempeh dressed in a peanut sauce lighter and more nuanced than the versions that have traveled abroad. One thing that stands out is how each of these dishes, despite being national staples, carries a distinct regional fingerprint that locals can identify instantly. Regional delicacies, however, push further still. Specialized bat and eel dishes in certain communities reflect a culinary adaptability that borders on the extraordinary. In parts of North Sulawesi, fruit bat prepared in a spicy coconut stew known as paniki is a dish that predates colonial influence by generations. If you encountered it at a local market, you'd find the flavor richer and gamier than chicken, with a texture somewhere between rabbit and dark meat poultry. Eel, too, appears across the archipelago, grilled over charcoal in Bali, smoked in Sumatra, simmered in turmeric-rich broths in Java. These aren't novelty dishes served to shock outsiders. They're food. And then there is Kopi Luwak, possibly the most unusual cup of coffee you will ever encounter. The process is strange, to put it mildly. The Asian palm civet, a small nocturnal mammal native to these forests, eats the ripest coffee cherries, digests the outer fruit, and excretes the inner beans, which are then collected, cleaned, and roasted into one of the costliest coffees in the world. The civet's digestive enzymes break down proteins in the bean that normally cause bitterness, producing a cup that is remarkably smooth, earthy, and low in acidity. But here's the complication. Mass demand has led to caged civets kept in poor conditions, and authentic wild-sourced Kopi Luwak is now extraordinarily difficult to verify. You'll find that even Indonesia's coffee holds the same tension the country seems to carry everywhere. Something ancient and extraordinary, pressed against something complicated and modern. And that same tension is now reshaping the nation itself, faster than most outsiders realize. a sinking capital and a nation racing forward. Indonesia declared independence from Dutch colonial rule in 1945, and what began as a fractured post-colonial state has, over roughly 8 decades, grown into the largest economy in Southeast Asia. The engine behind that growth is people. The country has one of the youngest workforces in the region. Millions of people under 30, digital, mobile, and carrying expectations that look nothing like their parents' lives. If you spend time in the commercial districts of Jakarta, you'll find a generation that grew up with smartphones and ride-hailing apps and startup incubators. A generation that seems to believe the country's best chapters are still being written. This is not just a population boom. It's a demographic wave reshaping what Indonesia looks like, sounds like, and aspires to. But Jakarta, the city at the center of all that momentum, is sinking. The capital sits on swampy coastal lowland along the Java Sea, and a combination of aggressive groundwater extraction and the sheer weight of urban concrete has caused parts of the city to subside at around 25 centimeters per year, among the fastest sinking rates of any major city on the planet. If you visit the northern neighborhoods, you'll notice seawalls being raised higher and higher, sometimes barely staying ahead of the water pressing in from the other side. The government's answer is one of the boldest urban relocation projects in modern history. A purpose-built capital called Nusantara, carved out of tropical forest in Borneo, designed to take over as the country's administrative heart. Whether it succeeds or not, the scale of that ambition tells you how serious the problem has become. The broader economy still runs on natural resources, manufacturing, and tourism. Indonesia is one of the world's largest producers of nickel, palm oil, and coal, and the export revenues from those commodities underwrite much of what the country has built over the past 2 decades. Manufacturing has grown steadily too. Textiles, electronics, automotive assembly, with industrial zones spread across Java feeding both domestic demand and global supply chains. And tourism, while not as dominant as in neighboring Thailand or Vietnam, pulls millions of visitors each year to places like Bali, where rice terraces and temple complexes sit alongside resorts that generate roughly 5% of the national economy. And here's something worth noting. Indonesians even have a phrase for their own sense of time, jam karet, meaning rubber time, that flexible, unhurried rhythm that seems to persist no matter how fast everything else moves. You'll find it in the way meetings start 10 minutes late without anyone apologizing, in the way a 5-minute errand stretches into an hour-long conversation. It's not laziness. It's a different orientation toward time itself, one that prioritizes relationships over schedules. It's a contradiction. The country is racing forward and slowing down, all at once. And maybe that is the truest thing you can say about Indonesia, a place where fire and water, the ancient and the urgent, the sinking and the rising all coexist. But the next country we're heading to tells a very different story. Smaller, quieter, and shaped by mountains rather than volcanoes. If you've traveled with us across these roughly 17,000 islands, you'll have noticed that Indonesia never settles into one image. It is fire and water, always, the two forces that built this archipelago and keep remaking it, sometimes within the same hour. Volcanoes thrust new land upward while the sea pulls coastlines down, and between those pressures an entire civilization keeps building temples, terracing mountainsides, and setting out daily offerings, as though the ground might hold still long enough for tomorrow. That tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. And here's something worth noting. Indonesia is not just a country sitting on the ring of fire. It is a country forged by it, fed by it, and somehow still thriving inside it. The sea nomads still dive as they have for centuries, the Komodo dragons still hunt on islands time nearly forgot, and the Toraja cliffs still echo with funeral songs older than any map. Nothing here is finished. Everything is still becoming